They were just a bunch of kids looking for a good time. No one goes camping deep in the woods expecting to become the subject of a horror story. But then again, stories have to come from somewhere. There were 5 of them. Ryan, the loudmouth leader. Jess, his girlfriend, tough as nails. Mark, the self-appointed cameraman. Tanya, the quiet one with big, observant eyes. And Kyle, the skeptic. They set up camp in Black Hollow, a stretch of woods infamous for urban legends, the kind you tell with a smirk while secretly hoping they aren't true. The first night was filled with laughter, beer, and ghost stories. Mark had brought his camera, a bulky old-school camcorder, he said, added to the horror aesthetic. He filmed their antics, their drunken slurring, the flickering campfire, casting wild shadows across their faces. It wasn't until the next morning that they noticed something was off. Mark reviewed the footage with a hangover pounding behind his eyes. He hit rewind, chuckling at Ryan's failed attempts at storytelling. Jess rolling her eyes, Tanya staring into the flames like she was hearing something the rest of them couldn't. But at the 2-hour mark, the footage changed. Something was out there beyond the firelight. Something watching 2 pinpricks of red hover just outside the circle of flickering flames, shifting slightly but never blinking. They weren't reflections, they weren't camera flares, they were eyes, and they were watching them. Kyle scoffed. Probably just an animal. What animal has red eyes? Jess shot back. Coyotes don't, neither do bears. Tanya, quiet until now, whispered. It was close. They brushed it off because that's what you do when things don't make sense. You joke, you rationalize, you pack it away in a neat little box labeled "not a big deal." And they kept drinking, kept filming, kept pretending. Until the second night. The campfire burned low as they told more stories, their laughter quieter than before. Mark kept the camera rolling. This time, when they checked the footage, the eyes were closer. Still on the edge of darkness, but closer. And now, there were 4 of them. Ryan, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Whatever's out there, it better fuck off. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating twisted branches, fallen leaves, nothing else. But they all felt it, the pressure of something just beyond sight, watching, listening, waiting. They barely slept, though they didn't say it aloud. Mark kept the camera in his hands like a security blanket. Tanya whispered prayers under her breath. Even Kyle had stopped making jokes. On the 3rd night, Mark vanished. It happened sometime between midnight and dawn. One moment, he was there, camera in his lap, eyes drooping from exhaustion. The next, his sleeping bag was empty, the tent flap hanging open. Ryan's voice cracked as he called out into the trees. Mark, quit screwing around, man. Silence. The camera was still inside the tent, half buried in dirt. When Jess hit play, the screen flickered to life. There was Mark, lying in his sleeping bag, shifting in his sleep. Then the red eyes appeared again. 6 of them now, right at the edge of the tent, barely outside the range of the firelight. The footage shook as Mark stirred, muttering in his sleep. Then suddenly, his eyes snapped open. He looked toward the camera, confused, scared. A slow guttural breath filled the speakers. The camera shifted. Mark sat up, staring toward the entrance of the tent. His voice, barely above a whisper. Who's there? Something moved. Something big. The camera caught only a glimpse. Dark, elongated fingers reaching inside, brushing against Mark's shoulder. Then the screen went black. The last thing recorded was a scream. not a normal scream. A wet, gurgling, dying scream. The 4 remaining friends ran. They abandoned their gear, their tents, everything. They didn't stop running until they reached the main road, where Jess flagged down a passing trucker, sobbing hysterically. The police found the campsite, found the camera, but not Mark. His sleeping bag was ripped apart. The dirt where he'd lain was slick with something dark and thick. The only thing they recovered was the camcorder. The footage made the news, a viral sensation for about a week before fading into obscurity. The story was written off as a hoax, a Blair Witch knockoff. Kids faking a haunting for internet fame. But Tanya knew better. She saw them even now, sometimes, in the corners of her room at night. Red eyes watching from the darkness, waiting. And sometimes, when she was very still, she swore she could hear Mark calling for help. His voice swallowed by the night. The nightmares started soon after. Tanya woke up one night to find her bedroom bathed in unnatural darkness, deeper than the usual night. The air was thick, suffocating. Then she heard it. A scratching noise at her window. She turned her head slowly, heart hammering. 2 red eyes stared at her through the glass. She screamed, scrambling to turn on the light, but the moment the bulb flickered on, the eyes vanished. Just like that. She barely slept after that. Jess stopped talking to her friends. Kyle moved to another state. Ryan, always the bravest, got into a car accident 2 months later. The paramedics said he swerved violently, like he was trying to avoid something in the road. His last words, whispered to a nurse before he died, were, "The red eyes. They're getting closer." The footage of that last night remained locked away in a police evidence room. Officers who reviewed it never spoke of what they saw. Some transferred out of town. Others left law enforcement entirely. But once, just once, Tanya worked up the nerve to track down a detective who had seen it. She met him at a diner, his hands shaking as he stirred his coffee. She asked him what happened, what they had seen. The man looked at her hollow-eyed, haunted. Then he whispered, "There was something behind Mark. Before the scream, something huge. Too tall for any man. Its eyes." He swallowed hard. They weren't just watching, they were hungry. Tanya left the diner and never looked back. But she knew one thing. The red eyes weren't done with them yet. The trip was supposed to be about bonding. Just a father and son, deep in the woods, away from the world. Thomas had promised his son, Jake, that they go camping after his last baseball game of the season. Just the 2 of them, like when he was little. Now Jake was 14, more interested in his phone than fishing. But Thomas hoped this trip would remind him of the simple joys. Roasting marshmallows, telling ghost stories, sleeping under the stars. They arrived at Blackwater Pines late in the afternoon, setting up their tent by a quiet, glassy lake. The trees around them stood tall and silent, the air crisp with the first touch of autumn. The only sounds were birds in the distance and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. Jake, reluctant at first, soon warmed up to the idea. He recorded everything with his camcorder, something he had picked up recently for a school project. "Might as well document the experience," he told his dad, aiming the lens at the flickering fire, the old tent. His father struggling to skewer a marshmallow without setting it on fire. That night, Thomas woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he heard something softer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing. He sat up, careful not to wake Jake, and listened. The sound moved around them, circling the tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He held his breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning, Thomas told himself it had been an animal, a deer, maybe, nothing unusual. Jake, oblivious, played back some of the footage from the night before, laughing at their marshmallow mishaps. Then the screen flickered. The footage stuttered, distorting, like an old VHS tape being chewed up in a player. The camera had been left running by accident, its lens facing the fog that had rolled in overnight. A shadow moved. At first, it was nothing but a blur, a wisp of something that could have been mistaken for the fog itself. But then it took shape. A woman, just barely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing. Her limbs moved strangely, like a marionette with its strings cut and hastily reattached. She tilted her head. Her face was wrong, blurred as if reality itself refused to render it properly. Then she whispered something, a single word. It was impossible to make out at first, but Jake rewound it, increasing the volume. A name. Michael? Jake looked at his dad. Who's Michael? Thomas had no answer. He didn't know any Michael. They checked the ground outside the tent. That's when they saw the footprints. Small, bare footprints, pressed deep into the dirt. A woman's prints. They weren't leading anywhere. They just circled the tent, around and around and around. The trip ended early. Thomas and Jake packed up and left before noon. Jake stayed quiet on the way home, replaying the footage again and again. But Thomas didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to think about it. That night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that it had been some weird trick of the light, a glitch in the camera, that he hadn't really seen those footprints, that he hadn't heard that name whispered from the screen. Then he heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, pacing, right outside his window. Extended story. The next morning, Thomas was exhausted. He barely got any sleep, and his nerves were frayed. He checked outside, but there was nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no strange figures in the trees. Just the wind rustling through the leaves. The morning sun cutting through the mist that still clung to the grass. He told himself he was imagining things. Stress, lack of sleep, leftover paranoia from the camping trip, that was all. But then Jake came downstairs, pale and wide-eyed, clutching the camcorder in his hands. She was here, he whispered. Last night. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Jake set the camera on the kitchen table and rewound the footage. He had left it on his nightstand, still recording. Another careless accident, or maybe something deeper. When Thomas saw what was on the screen, his blood turned to ice. The same fog from the woods, creeping into Jake's bedroom through the open window. And then, movement. The woman stepped into the frame. Her limbs twitched, jerking as though she were learning how to move. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her face, still blurred, still wrong, turned toward the camera. She whispered again, Michael? And then, as if she could sense them watching her even now, her head snapped up. The distorted face shifted, the blurry mass twisting as if it were trying to become clearer. Her lips parted, stretching into something that might have been a smile, except it was too wide, too unnatural. Jake slammed the camera shut. What do we do? Thomas didn't have an answer. He didn't even know what they were dealing with. A ghost? A hallucination? A warning? He spent the next few days researching. There was nothing about a woman in the fog, no legends, no ghost stories. But then, deep in an old newspaper archive, he found something. 30 years ago, a man named Michael Carter had gone missing near Blackwater Pines. He had been camping with his wife, Eleanor. She had disappeared too, but her body was found a week later, floating in the lake. Her face had been unrecognizable, waterlogged and distorted, as if she had been down there much longer than a week. The authorities ruled it an accident, but the case was never really closed. Thomas sat back in his chair, stomach twisting into knots. The woman in the fog had whispered a name. Michael. Was she looking for him? Calling out for the husband she lost? Or was she trying to warn them about something worse? That night the fog rolled in thicker than ever. Thomas locked the doors and windows, pulling Jake close as the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, pacing. This time, they didn't stop. And somewhere in the distance, carried by the mist, a whisper drifted through the trees. Michael, come home.